The Senate chamber, often a stage of rehearsed lines and cautious glances, suddenly felt alive, as if history itself had paused to listen. Cameras clicked, murmurs rippled through the room, and then came the voice that silenced them all. Elizabeth Warren, measured, deliberate, unflinching, looked across the table and said words no one expected to hear. "Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett," she began, her tone more reverent than rhetorical, "has just shown this chamber what intellect, clarity, and moral conviction truly look like." For a breathless moment, nothing moved. You could hear the hum of microphones, the shuffle of a single paper, the collective inhale of those who knew they'd just witnessed something unscripted, something real. On screens across the country, clips of that instant began spreading before the echo had even faded. The headlines were instant. Warren breaks Senate silence. Warren praises Crockett. Internet erupts. A moment that began as a simple acknowledgement had turned into a cultural spark. The camera lingered on Crockett.com. Composed, her expression, a quiet mixture of gratitude and disbelief. No smirk, no self-congratulation, only grace. She nodded once, as if understanding that the praise wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger. The recognition of intellect in a room that too often takes volume for strength. The reaction outside was electric. Clips raced through social feeds. Flooded TikTok timelines echoed across late-night panels. Young viewers replayed it like a cinematic climax, framing Warren's praise as a rare act of political honesty. Others called it a torch-passing moment, one woman's courage acknowledging another's brilliance. Inside the chamber, however, you could still feel the tension beneath the applause. Some faces turned away, unwilling to validate the moment. Others leaned forward, studying Warren as if she'd broken an unspoken rule. For a heartbeat, the room wasn't divided by party lines, but by something deeper, those who understood the weight of those words, and those who feared what they signified, because this wasn't just praise. It was rebellion wrapped in respect. A statement against the quiet condescension that shadows every woman who dares to speak with fire and intellect. In the halls of power, but few understood what led to this extraordinary moment, or why it carried a meaning far deeper than applause. Before that moment of applause and astonishment, the air in Washington had been heavy, not with progress, but with exhaustion. The Senate floor had become less a place of governance and more a theater of endless feuds. Sound bites replaced substance. Outrage had become the new currency of relevance. Every question, every speech, every raised eyebrow seemed designed for virality rather than truth. And amid that noise, the idea of integrity had started to feel like nostalgia. Weeks before the hearing, pundits described the political mood as combustible. Voters weren't just tired, they were disillusioned. Polls showed record cynicism toward government institutions, and each televised debate seemed to confirm why. Politicians argued not to solve problems, but to survive the news cycle. It was a competition of volume, not vision. The higher the outrage, the greater the spotlight. Inside those marble walls, hierarchy ruled. Seniority mattered more than sincerity. Power protected itself through decorum, a kind of polite gatekeeping dressed as procedure. For newcomers, especially women and people of color, it meant walking into a space that demanded they shrink before they spoke. And if they refused to, their competence was questioned, their passion reframed as anger, their authority dismissed as ambition. That's the environment Jasmine Crockett stepped into. An arena where truth was often tolerated only if it came wrapped in deference. Her sharpness made people uneasy. Her clarity made them defensive. Every time she confronted hypocrisy, the old guard whispered that she was too direct, too bold, too much. They said it as if that were a flaw, not a threat to their comfort. And yet, amid this fog of posturing, Warren's moment cut through like lightning, because acknowledgement, genuine, public, unfiltered acknowledgement, had become an act of rebellion. In a chamber built on ego, to praise another woman's brilliance without calculation was to break the unspoken rule that power must always protect its own image first. For Warren, it wasn't strategy. It was conviction. For the system, it was disruption. In that single exchange, something shifted. The praise was brief, but its impact lingered precisely because it was authentic. It reminded viewers that truth still exists, even if it rarely survives the filters of politics on social media. People began to say what many had felt but couldn't articulate, that leadership isn't about dominance, but about recognition. That humility from the powerful is more radical than grandstanding from the loud. That in a culture of constant self-promotion, the rare act of lifting someone else up carries revolutionary weight. Even Warren's critics seemed momentarily disarmed. They couldn't spin her words into cynicism because they came from the one place. The political machine can't manufacture sincerity, and that's why the moment stunned the chamber. It wasn't the praise itself. It was the authenticity behind it. The rare glimpse of integrity that reminded the nation of what politics could still be when stripped of vanity. Because in that silence, in that fleeting pause between applause and analysis, everyone felt something they hadn't in a long time. Hope that maybe, just maybe, truth could still echo louder than ego. To understand the weight of Warren's words, you have to know the story of the woman who earned them, before the moment of recognition. Before the praise that rippled through the chamber, there was the quiet war, the one fought not with fists or fury, but with condescension, interruption, and erasure. The antagonist here isn't a person in a suit. It's the atmosphere itself, the invisible but heavy presence of a system that treats brilliance like a threat when it doesn't come packaged in the familiar language of privilege. For years, Jasmine Crockett's voice had echoed in rooms that didn't expect her to speak with that much precision, that much force, that much grace. She wasn't supposed to hold her ground with such calm conviction. She wasn't supposed to challenge senior members and do it without a tremor in her tone. The system wasn't built for someone like her. It was built to politely remind her of her place. Rewind through the montage of moments that defined this pattern. Hearings where she was interrupted mid-sentence, while male colleagues were given endless time to ramble. Debates where her logic was deflected not because it was flawed, but because it was undeniable. The subtle eye rolls, the smirks, the way cameras cut away just as she landed a point too sharp to ignore. Every gesture was a message. Know your role. Don't disturb the order. But Crockett did disturb it every time she refused to shrink. Her poise made the arrogant uncomfortable. Her intellect disarmed those who depended on theatrics. In a space obsessed with hierarchy, she spoke like someone who owed the system nothing, and that's precisely what made her dangerous. The villainy here was quiet, procedural, and rehearsed. It lived in the rules of decorum, in the whispers of, "That's not how things are done here," in the selective enforcement of respect. It wore civility like armor, while dismissing passion as impropriety. The same Senate that applauds itself for diversity still measures legitimacy through the lens of pedigree, where every challenge from a younger, black, female lawmaker becomes an act of defiance by default. There were hearings where she questioned officials with surgical clarity, only to have her questions talked over, her tone dissected. Commentators called her fiery, a word never used for the men who shouted louder. Others accused her of grandstanding, as if eloquence were an offense. The game was always the same: diminish the moment before it could gain momentum. In the back rooms, some whispered that she was too new to be so bold, as if intellect needed seniority's permission, as if conviction had to wait its turn. And yet, every slight seemed to sharpen her resolve. For every time her mic was cut, her message grew stronger online. For every headline that downplayed her substance, clips of her composure went viral. Audiences, seeing in her what the chamber refused to admit: unfiltered competence. That's the paradox of this culture of dismissal. It breeds resistance in the very people it tries to silence. In trying to contain authenticity, the establishment ends up amplifying it. Crockett didn't just navigate that environment, she decoded it, learned to use its own rituals against it. Where others performed for attention, she performed for clarity. Where others sought to dominate, she sought to reveal. Still, the toll was real. Every dismissive glance, every clipped reply carried the weight of centuries of who gets to speak and who's expected to listen. Her presence in that chamber was both victory and burden, a constant reminder that progress doesn't erase prejudice. It only forces it to disguise itself. But through all of it, there was an underlying fear among those who underestimated her. Fear of the moment she'd no longer be ignored. Fear that someone like Jasmine Crockett, armed with intellect and integrity, would expose the absurd fragility of a system built on gatekeeping. And that fear came to life the day Warren spoke her name with admiration. Because in that instant, every unspoken slight, every dismissive act, every attempt to minimize her worth stood exposed. The system that thrived on silence had just been interrupted, not by shouting, but by acknowledgement. But Jasmine Crockett was never built to shrink, and her rise began long before the Plus Senate ever knew her name, before the cameras and headlines, before the polished speeches and viral clips. There was a young attorney in Texas walking into courtrooms where she was underestimated before she even opened her mouth. Jasmine Crockett didn't come from the corridors of inherited power. She came from the places where justice was not an abstraction, but a necessity. She built her name not on favors or family ties, but on the bruising front lines of inequality, defending the unheard, challenging the untouchable, and refusing to let power define what was possible. In those early years, she was known for her relentlessness. Judges, colleagues, even her opponents would admit, sometimes reluctantly, that she had a way of dissecting an argument until pretense collapsed under its own weight. She was sharp, but never cruel, assertive, but never reckless. Her weapon wasn't volume. It was precision. The more the establishment dismissed her, the sharper that precision became. She carried herself like someone aware that every word she spoke carried the weight of those who never got the microphone. There were nights when she stayed in her office long after the lights dimmed, surrounded by case files that told stories of those society had already given up on, single mothers facing impossible odds, young men trapped in cycles of injustice, workers silenced by bureaucracy. To her, these weren't just cases. They were battles for dignity, and each small victory hardened her resolve, chiseling away any trace of doubt that the system could be reformed only from within its walls, by someone who refused to mirror its cynicism. Her rise wasn't fast. It was earned inch by inch. In a landscape that rewarded conformity over conviction, when she ran for office, few gave her a chance. Her campaign didn't have the backing of old money or big donors. It was fueled by the people she'd stood beside in courtrooms and community meetings, the ones who believed in her because she had once believed in them when no one else did. She spoke in plain truths, not rehearsed slogans. She didn't promise to fit in, she promised to show up. And when she won, it wasn't just a victory on paper. It was proof that intellect and integrity could still carve their way through the concrete of complacency. Inside Congress, she became a quiet storm. While others rehearsed outrage for the cameras, she wielded facts like a scalpel. She dismantled hypocrisy with calm grace, never needing to shout to make her presence felt. Her speeches blended logic with conviction, weaving the language of law and the pulse of lived experience into something neither side of the aisle could easily ignore. It was this balance, intellect anchored by empathy, that set her apart. She didn't seek viral moments, but they found her anyway, because authenticity has a way of breaking through filters. Her exchanges went viral not for drama, but for clarity, the kind of clarity that made viewers sit back and say, "That's what truth sounds like." Yet what made Jasmine Crockett remarkable wasn't just her command of law or language. It was her refusal to let bitterness define her. She knew the cost of standing tall in a system designed to bend you. She knew that every time she spoke with fire, there would be those who called it arrogance. But she also knew that silence would cost more. She carried herself with a grace that came not from privilege but from endurance, the quiet kind that grows in people who've had to prove their worth twice just to be heard once. Her story, when told fully, reads like a slow crescendo, not a meteoric rise, but a symphony of persistence. Every obstacle was a note, every dismissal a chord that built toward resonance. She wasn't trying to win the game of politics. She was rewriting its score, and that's what Warren saw. When the senator praised her that day, it wasn't spontaneous. It was overdue recognition of years spent fighting uphill without bitterness. of a woman who refused to play small so others could stay comfortable. Warren's words carried the weight of generations, one woman acknowledging another who had walked through the same fire, only with different flames. Crockett's brilliance was not the kind that seeks attention. It was the kind that commands it. It came from the courtroom's fluorescent lights, from the long hours of study, from the moments she was told no and answered with proof instead of protest. It came from the moral courage to believe that service could still be noble, even when surrounded by those who treated it like a game. She was not the loudest, but she was the most unshakable. She didn't enter politics to be a spectacle. She entered to be a standard, and when she finally entered that Senate chamber, she brought with her something Washington hadn't seen in a long time: unfiltered truth. The Senate chamber was supposed to be routine that morning, another hearing, another exchange of rehearsed indignation dressed as debate. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood, paper, and politics. Senators shifted in their seats, aides whispered behind laptops, cameras hummed quietly like they could sense the tension before it arrived. But then Jasmine Crockett began to speak, and the rhythm of the room changed. Her voice wasn't loud. It was measured, deliberate, every word shaped by intention. Across the chamber, a senior senator had just finished a performance, a monologue of polished cynicism, defending the indefensible with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The kind of speech meant to sound reasonable while erasing responsibility. When Crockett's turn came, the murmurs stilled. She adjusted her papers once, looked up, and started with a question that sliced through the air like a clean blade. If accountability is partisan, what does that make integrity? The line hung there, elegant, simple, impossible to dodge. You could almost feel the silence trying to rearrange itself around it. What followed wasn't fireworks, it was precision. Crockett deconstructed the senator's talking points one by one, not with outrage, but with facts, law, and unflinching logic. Her tone never wavered. When they interrupted, she paused, not to concede, but to let their noise expose itself. Her calm was its own form of defiance. Every statistic, every precedent, every citation she laid out was a quiet revelation of how deeply she'd done her homework, how unwilling she was to let performance masquerade as principle. Reporters' eyes darted up from their screens. Phones lifted. Staffers exchanged looks that said, "This is different." What had started as a procedural debate was becoming something else entirely, a reckoning dressed as dialogue. The senator tried to regain footing, leaning into sarcasm. He called her spirited, the way powerful men do when they run out of arguments. The insult was sugar-coated, but everyone heard the bitterness underneath. Crockett didn't flinch. She smiled, small, sharp, and replied, "If truth sounds spirited to you, then maybe it's because you're not used to hearing it." A ripple spread through the chamber. The remark wasn't shouted, but it landed with the quiet impact of authority earned, not bestowed. The energy shifted. One by one, senators who had been half listening began to focus. Some leaned back in quiet discomfort, others in fascination. Warren watched closely. Not the kind of watching that's polite, but the kind that studies ways and recognizes something rare unfolding. Crockett moved from point to point, weaving a tapestry of facts and moral clarity that made the debate feel less like politics and more like a masterclass in truth-telling. Her cadence had rhythm, her reasoning had teeth. She wasn't debating for applause. She was dismantling an illusion. Every time the opposition reached for a deflection, she met it with an undeniable reality: data, law, human consequence. It wasn't anger driving her. It was precision born of lived conviction. By the time she concluded, the chamber was a different place. You could sense it in the stillness, the unspoken acknowledgement that something had just shifted in the atmosphere. No one dared fill the silence too quickly. Even those who disagreed knew they'd witnessed control at its purest form, intellect without arrogance, passion without spectacle. And then came the murmurs, faint, scattered building. A senator whispered to another, "She's something else." A few staffers nodded discreetly, as if confirming what everyone had just seen but couldn't quite process. The cameras zoomed in on Crockett's expression, calm, grounded. Untouched by the theater around her, Warren's eyes didn't leave her. There was recognition in that gaze, not of a political ally, but of a kindred spirit. Someone who understood that real power doesn't come from seniority or sound bites. It comes from clarity. From refusing to bend your truth to fit the room, the chair tried to move on to the next speaker. But the moment lingered, like a suspended note in a symphony, refusing to resolve. The audience watching from home felt it too. The clip would later dominate headlines, but in that instant, it was pure electricity, the kind that only appears when authenticity collides with arrogance and wins. And then, in one of those unscripted moments that defined history, Warren leaned forward. The room held its breath as Elizabeth Warren leaned forward, elbows resting on the mahogany desk, her gaze fixed on Jasmine Crockett. What came next wasn't planned, scripted, or politically convenient. It was instinct, the kind that comes from one truth-teller recognizing another. Her voice, when it broke the silence, carried the weight of both intellect and emotion. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, steady but unmistakably charged. "That was one of the clearest, most grounded dismantlings of bad faith I've heard in this chamber in years." The sentence seemed to echo longer than it should have. Bouncing off marble walls, breaking through the invisible hierarchy that usually governs who praises whom in Washington. For a moment, even the fluorescent light seemed to soften. Senators who rarely looked up from their notes were suddenly watching, some in admiration, others in quiet disbelief. Compliments like that weren't supposed to happen here, not across power lines, not from veterans to freshmen, and certainly not in public. Warren wasn't smiling. She wasn't grandstanding. Her tone was deliberate, like every syllable had passed through the filter of conscience before reaching her mouth. "What you did just now," she continued, "reminded this chamber what accountability sounds like when it isn't rehearsed." You could almost hear hearts racing, aides, journalists, even the senators themselves. The compliment wasn't ornamental. It was revolutionary. It wasn't about politics. It was about validation in its purest form, earned, uninvited, and undeniable. Crockett sat still, hands folded, eyes forward. She didn't rush to respond. The power of the moment wasn't in reply, but in composure. Her expression carried grace, gratitude tempered with understanding, because she knew exactly what had just happened. This wasn't a mentor tossing a kind word to a newcomer. This was acknowledgement across generations, of struggle from one woman who had fought her way into respectability, to another who had carved her space through brilliance and grit. The camera panned between them, the seasoned progressive warrior and the rising voice of a new political era. In that brief silence, you could feel decades of exclusion, skepticism, and dismissive smirks start to dissolve. Then came the line that would replay across every platform before the hour ended. Warren leaned closer to her microphone and said, "You remind this body that clarity isn't noise, it's leadership." Gasps, a few murmurs. Someone at the back muttered, "Did she just say that on record?" But yes, she did, and the microphones caught every word. The statement sliced through the procedural monotony like sunlight through storm clouds. The reaction was instant. On social media, clips appeared within minutes. One post read, "Elizabeth Warren just said what millions have been thinking about Jasmine Crockett finally. Someone in power gets it." Another captioned the moment, "Goosebumps. Pure respect." A slow-motion replay circulated, set to swelling music, as if history itself demanded cinematic treatment. News anchors on evening broadcasts would later call it a cross-generational passing of the torch. Commentators argued whether it was symbolic or strategic. But to the people watching, to every young woman, every black professional, every outsider who'd ever been told to wait their turn, it wasn't politics. It was vindication. Warren, known for her razor-sharp questioning and fierce independence, rarely broke the fourth wall of decorum. Yet here she was, not debating, not correcting, acknowledging. Her tone wasn't one of flattery, but of reverence. And that's what made it thunder through the chamber. Even the opposition benches shifted uncomfortably. The usual smirks faded. For once, there was no quick retort, no rehearsed talking point to neutralize authenticity. Respect had entered the room, and it silenced performance. Crockett finally nodded once, subtly. Her eyes glimmered, but her posture remained strong, as though she knew. The most powerful response was to hold the space Warren had just cleared for her. Her thank you was quiet, almost whispered. But the humility in it carried louder than applause. And then something remarkable happened. Warren smiled. Not a political smile, but the kind reserved for recognition. The kind that says, "You've arrived, and we see you." It was the closest thing to mentorship ever caught live in the halls of American power. The Senate floor had turned briefly into a stage for something larger than politics, grace in real time. Crockett's restraint was its own mic drop. The kind that didn't need volume, because truth had already filled the room. Across the country, people watched the clip over and over. Comments poured in. This is what representation looks like. Finally. Women, uplifting women in power. This gave me chills. Hashtags trended. Hashtag Warren Crockett moment. Hashtag women hooled. Hashtag truth and power. Pundits debated whether Warren's words marked a shift or a statement. But for millions, the meaning was simpler. Two women from different eras. Bound by conviction, cutting through a system addicted to its own noise. And yet, the beauty of that moment wasn't just in Warren's acknowledgement, it was in how Crockett received it. No self-congratulation, no performance, just dignity. Because she understood what Warren was really saying between the lines. You didn't just win an argument, you changed what the argument is. It's allowed to sound like. Cameras continued flashing as the chair tried to restore order. But the balance had already shifted. A symbolic baton had been passed, not through ceremony, but through recognition. In that instant, the chamber felt lighter, as if truth itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The clip looped endlessly on news feeds. Commentators replayed Warren's exact phrasing, analyzing tone and body language like historians studying the Declaration. Every pause, every inflection was dissected. What made it powerful wasn't what she said, it was what it meant. That merit. Not hierarchy had spoken loudest that day. By nightfall, headlines read, Elizabeth Warren praises Jasmine Crockett in Senate, and the internet explodes. Editorials called it the rare kind of moment that renews faith in leadership. But beyond headlines, something quieter was happening. Conversations in living rooms. Messages between young professionals, students writing, "Did you see this? This is what hope sounds like." That's what made it cinematic. Not the camera angles or the sound bites, but the truth that radiated beyond walls. Beyond party lines, beyond cynicism. And as Warren leaned back, the faintest smile still on her face, Crockett gathered her papers. The session would continue, as all sessions do. But the room would never feel quite the same again, because sometimes history doesn't announce itself with applause. Sometimes it arrives in the form of one woman's courage meeting, another's acknowledgement, and leaving the world just a little more awake. But what happened next proved that this wasn't just a Senate moment, it was a movement being born by evening. The moment had already outgrown the chamber that birthed it. The clip of Elizabeth Warren's words, that brief exchange of truth and recognition, spread across timelines like wildfire. News tickers replayed it on a loop, and within hours, hashtags were blazing. Hashtag Warren Crockett moment. Hashtag truth and power. Hashtag women who lead. What had begun as a quiet act of acknowledgement now pulsed across the digital landscape like a collective heartbeat. On TikTok, creators layered the clip with cinematic soundtracks, strings swelling, as Warren said. Clarity isn't noise, it's leadership. On Instagram, activists stitched Crockett's poised expression into montages celebrating women who changed the game. Twitter, or whatever it was calling itself this week, became a chorus of awe. I didn't know I needed this moment until I saw it. For once, politics felt human. Cable news panels scrambled to catch up. On one network, a commentator called it the rare Senate moment that felt like poetry. Another tried to frame it as strategic solidarity, suggesting Warren's praise was calculated, an attempt to appeal to a younger, more diverse audience. But their cynicism wilted under the weight of the public's reaction. Viewers weren't interested in strategy. They were hungry for sincerity. The video reached millions within hours, not because of algorithms, but because of emotion. People weren't sharing a political highlight. They were sharing a feeling, that fleeting, goosebump sense that maybe, just maybe, decency and brilliance could still matter in American power. Even late-night hosts chimed in. One joked, "If Warren and Crockett start a podcast, the Senate might finally get a rating boost." And another paused mid-monologue and said, more seriously, "What you saw wasn't politics. It was what politics is supposed to be." The audience erupted, not in laughter, but in applause. Meanwhile, young women across the country began quoting Crockett. Her words from the hearing, those precise, unflinching lines, became mantras. Classroom discussions opened with clips of her exchange. College students wrote essays on how representation isn't just visual, it's intellectual. A high schooler in Atlanta posted a video saying, "She looks like my aunt. She talks like my debate coach. She makes me believe I can stand in that room someday." The comments beneath it flooded with agreement. Activists picked up Warren's phrase, "Clarity isn't noise," and turned it into rally banners, protest slogans, and podcast titles. It was more than a compliment now. It was a cultural reset button, a reminder that truth could still cut through cynicism if spoken without apology. But as the praise grew, so did the backlash. Political opportunists tried to spin it, claiming Warren's words were performative, or that Crockett's poise was rehearsed. Clips were edited, context twisted, motives questioned. Yet every attempt to distort it only made the authenticity shine brighter. Because when something real happens, the audience can feel it, and this moment felt undeniably real. Journalists began writing essays titled "The Day Respect Made a Comeback." Op-eds framed it as a generational shift from shouting to listening, from spectacle to substance. One column in The Atlantic read, "In a town where ego often drowns out reason, two women managed to make humility sound radical." The story even reached global headlines. International outlets covered it not as a partisan headline but as a cultural phenomenon. In London, a news anchor called it a moment of moral clarity in American politics. In Kenya, a columnist wrote, "What Warren said to Crockett was more than praise. It was permission for a new kind of power to take root." Within days, think pieces gave way to something more personal. Testimony. People from all walks of life, teachers, lawyers, students, mothers, began sharing what the moment meant to them. For some, it was the first time they'd felt seen by their government. For others, it was proof that respect could still rise above rivalry. Even inside Washington, the aftershocks were felt. Staffers whispered that the dynamic in committee rooms had shifted. "People are listening differently now," one aide confided to a reporter. "They're actually afraid of being condescending because they saw what happens when someone stands in their power and doesn't flinch." And beneath all the trending tags, all the viral edits, there was something subtler, taking shape, a collective reawakening of faith. Faith that truth could still pierce through rehearsed debate. Faith that integrity could still earn the spotlight without asking for it. Faith that women, particularly women of color, could redefine authority not by mirroring the system, but by elevating it, somewhere between the headlines and the hashtags. The noise quieted, and what remained was resonance. Because this wasn't just about two women sharing a moment. It was about a nation witnessing what happens when courage meets, recognition when respect replaces rivalry, as one journalist put it in her viral op-ed. It wasn't Warren validating Crockett. It was Warren validating what America could still be. And in that echo, the viewers found themselves reflected not as spectators, but as believers again. Yet beneath all the noise, one simple truth began to echo louder than headlines. Elizabeth Warren's acknowledgement of Jasmine Crockett was more than a headline. It was a reminder that power, when exercised with humility, can elevate rather than dominate. In a world where ego often masquerades as authority, Warren's words were a rare act of clarity, a recognition that brilliance need not be diminished to preserve hierarchy. For one fleeting moment, the Senate floor became a stage for integrity. It's not spectacle. The significance of that moment extends beyond politics. It's a lesson in the enduring power of mentorship, not the formal kind, but the human kind. One woman, seasoned by experience and struggle, validating the rise of another who carries the same courage into a world that rarely welcomes it. It was proof that progress does not require the permission of tradition, only the acknowledgement of those who understand its weight. Across America, this exchange resonated because it spoke to something universal, the desire to see merit recognized, to see voices that are often minimized finally heard. For women, especially women of color, it was a mirror reflecting possibility. It affirmed that intelligence, courage, and moral clarity are worthy of acknowledgement, not fear. That rising in one's purpose need not threaten the established order if the established order is willing to recognize truth. It was also a lesson in timing and patience. Crockett's journey from attorney to congresswoman reminds us that integrity is forged in persistence. In the quiet moments of diligence and courage before the applause arrives, Warren's praise did not happen in a vacuum. It was inevitable because it honored a trajectory built on consistency, principle, and moral conviction. The world took note, not merely because of what was said, but because of the years of work that had made it impossible to ignore. There is a broader moral embedded in this story. It is a call to lift others up, to recognize potential without hesitation, to celebrate intellect without compromise. In a culture too often defined by competition and hierarchy, acknowledgement becomes revolutionary. It signals that leadership is not about silencing others to be heard, but about amplifying voices that deserve resonance. It transforms power from a tool of control into a force for inspiration. Moreover, the moment reflected America at its best. Beyond partisan lines and ideological divides, there exists a yearning for fairness, for authenticity, for the triumph of merit over performance. Warren and Crockett, in that brief exchange, modeled a dynamic that transcends political theater: courage meeting recognition, preparation meeting opportunity, humility meeting brilliance. It was a silent lesson to the nation that acknowledgement is not weakness, that respect is not compromise, and that history often turns on the recognition of truth. For the viewers who witnessed it, the takeaway was simple, yet profound. Leadership does not demand arrogance. Success does not require overshadowing others. Integrity does not wait for approval. And when women support one another, when experience validates emerging brilliance, the ripple effects extend far beyond a single chamber or a single clip. They touch classrooms, dinner tables, activist meetings, and hearts across the country, in essence. Warren's words to Crockett were a crystallization of what America could aspire to be: a society that celebrates intellect without fear, courage without compromise, and truth without hesitation. It was an acknowledgement that power is at its most potent when wielded with conscience. And that recognition, authentic recognition, has the ability to transform not only individuals, but the culture around them. And in that chamber, for just a moment, America saw what respect truly looks like. The moment Elizabeth Warren acknowledged. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another headline. It was a statement about what leadership, courage, and integrity truly look like. It reminded us all that greatness isn't measured by how loudly you speak, how many followers you have, or how perfectly rehearsed your performance appears. True greatness is recognizing brilliance when it stands before you and giving it the acknowledgement it deserves. Across the country, viewers felt that spark, a mix of pride, hope, and awe. It wasn't just about politics. It was about human dignity. It was about witnessing authenticity cut through ego, humility, elevate courage, and truth claim the spotlight it had earned. Moments like these show that change doesn't always come with legislation alone. Sometimes it arrives in the acknowledgement of another person's worth, in the ripple effect of respect. So today, take that lesson beyond the screen. Celebrate the people who inspire you, who challenge the system with integrity, who show up even when the world tries to quiet them. Share these moments, talk about them, and let them remind others that acknowledgement matters. Because every time brilliance is recognized, Every time respect is given without hesitation, we move closer to the world we hope to see, one where courage is visible. Intellect is valued, and integrity leads the way. If this story inspired you, share it, celebrate it, and keep it alive. Encourage the people around you to stand tall, speak with truth, and lift others up. Because when we honor brilliance, when we recognize courage, we're not just watching history, we're helping to shape it.